Have you ever wandered through the ruins of a medieval castle or stood in the shadow of an ancient stone tower and found yourself captivated by its windows? Not just their beauty, but their bewildering variety, no two seem exactly alike. At first glance, it might appear random, a simple quirk of old-world craftsmanship. But what if I told you that this lack of uniformity was not a flaw, but a feature, that every arch, every slit, every pane of colored glass was part of a complex, unspoken language, a language that spoke of power, faith, fear, and human ingenuity? These windows were far more than openings for light and air. They were carefully crafted messages etched in stone and lead, designed to be read by friends and foes alike. They told everyone who laid eyes on them exactly who built this place, what they valued, what they feared, and who held power within these walls. Think about that for a moment. In a world before mass media, before newspapers or television, architecture was one of the most powerful forms of communication. A castle wasn't just a home, it was a statement. And its windows were a crucial part of that statement. A narrow, cross-shaped opening wasn't just a window, it was a declaration of defensibility, a clear warning to any would-be attacker that archers waited within. A grand, soaring stained glass scene wasn't just decoration, it was a visual sermon, a way to convey sacred stories to a population that largely couldn't read. The size, the shape, the ornamentation, every single detail was a deliberate choice, a word in this silent, stone-carved vocabulary. This is the secret language we're going to decode together. So join me on a journey back through centuries, into the minds of medieval masons and the hearts of those who lived within these stone giants. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating architectural mysteries. We'll discover how a window could be a weapon, a prayer, a status symbol, and an artist's canvas all at once. We'll see how the available materials, the local climate, and even the superstitions of the time left their unique fingerprints on every opening. This is a story about why true beauty and genius often lie in diversity, not sameness. By the end of our exploration, you will never look at an old stone wall the same way again. You'll start to see the stories, to hear the whispers of the past coming through every unique frame. This is the secret language of windows in medieval towers, and you're about to become fluent. To understand this incredible diversity, we have to travel back to the very beginning, to a time not of soaring stone cathedrals, but of sturdy, earth-hugging fortresses. In the chaotic centuries following the fall of Rome, often called the Dark Ages, survival was the paramount concern. Architecture reflected this stark reality. The earliest medieval windows were less about welcoming the sun and more about keeping the world out. They were simple, narrow openings, little more than slits carved through immensely thick walls. Think of them as functional necessities, like a submarine's porthole, designed for one primary purpose: to let in a sliver of light and a draft of air without offering an easy entry point for attackers. Glass was an unimaginable luxury, so these openings were often shuttered with wooden boards or covered with oiled cloth or parchment, leaving interiors dim, smoky, and cavernous. This defensive mindset was born from a world fractured into small, competing kingdoms and lordships. A noble's power was measured by the strength of his fortress, and every architectural element, especially windows, was evaluated for its contribution to defense. The small size wasn't just a limitation of technology, it was a deliberate strategy. A narrow opening was incredibly difficult for an enemy archer to hit from the outside, while giving a defender inside a protected angle to return fire. These early windows were purely pragmatic, a direct response to a dangerous and uncertain time. Their design was dictated by fear and the constant threat of violence, placing security far above aesthetics. But societies don't stand still. As the early medieval period gave way to more stable political structures around the 11th and 12th centuries, a new confidence began to emerge. This shift is perfectly captured in the architectural style known as Romanesque. Builders, inspired by the remnants of Roman grandeur they saw around them, began to experiment with more substantial structures. Romanesque windows retained that defensive, fortress-like feel but started to incorporate more artistry. Instead of a plain slit, you might see a small, rounded arch at the top, a direct echo of the massive Roman aqueducts and colosseums. The openings were still relatively small because the walls needed to be enormously thick to support the heavy stone barrel vaults inside, but the craftsmanship became more refined. It was a transitional phase where builders were rediscovering the possibilities of stone and beginning to think about form as well as function. The real revolution, however, was just on the horizon. It was a perfect storm of innovation that would shatter the old limits of design. First, architectural breakthroughs like the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and most importantly, the flying buttress fundamentally changed structural engineering. These innovations allowed weight to be channeled down through slender columns and out into external supports. Suddenly, walls no longer had to be solid, load-bearing masses. They could become skeletal frames, and the space between the stones could be filled with something new and miraculous: glass. This was the birth of the Gothic style, and it completely transformed the concept of a window. With a wall itself no longer a structural limitation, windows could explode in size and complexity. This was coupled with advances in glass production. While still expensive, glass became more accessible for major projects like cathedrals and royal palaces. Craftsmen developed the techniques for creating stunning stained glass, transforming sunlight into a medium for divine storytelling. The window was no longer just a hole in a wall. It became a canvas, a storybook, and a source of awe-inspiring beauty. This dramatic shift from small, defensive openings to vast, luminous walls of glass tells a deeper story. It mirrors a broader cultural movement from an inward-looking society focused on protection to an outward-looking one yearning for light, transcendence, and connection with the divine. The evolution of the window, from a fearful slit to a glorious expanse of color and light, is perhaps one of the most powerful physical records we have of the medieval mind emerging from the shadows. But those small, dim openings of the early medieval period were about to take on a far more aggressive role. As castles evolved into complex fortresses, the window shed its passive existence and became a weapon in its own right. This transformation is most perfectly captured in the design of the arrow slit, a feature so ingenious in its simplicity that it revolutionized castle defense. Imagine a vertical cut in the stone tall enough for a person to stand within, but so narrow that from the outside it was barely a target. This was not a window for enjoying a view, it was a carefully engineered firing port. The genius of its design lay in the embrasure, the splayed opening on the inside of the wall. This created a wide field of fire for the archer standing safely within the thick stone, allowing them to aim and shoot across a significant arc of the battlefield below, all while being protected by the narrow external opening that was almost impossible for an enemy arrow to find. The placement of these defensive windows was a meticulous art form, a deadly game of chess played in stone. Architects and military engineers would spend hours studying the sightlines from a half-built tower, identifying every possible approach an enemy could take. Each arrow slit was positioned to cover a specific killing zone, ensuring there were no blind spots where attackers could gather safely. They were staggered around towers to provide overlapping fields of fire, creating a crossfire that would rain down on any assault. The height was also crucial. Slits were placed at different levels to allow defenders on multiple floors to engage the enemy simultaneously. This strategic positioning meant that the exterior of a well-designed castle presented a terrifying prospect: a blank, towering wall seemingly studded with hundreds of invisible, watching eyes, each one capable of delivering a lethal shot from the darkness within. The design of these openings was also a direct response to the evolving technology of warfare. The size and shape of an arrow slit were not arbitrary. They were custom-fitted to the weapon it was meant to serve. Early slits designed for the longbow were often simple vertical openings, but as the crossbow grew in prominence, a new design emerged: the cross-shaped aperture. The horizontal bar provided the extra width a crossbowman needed to comfortably aim and fire his heavier, bulkier weapon without sacrificing the protective narrowness of the vertical slit. In some regions, you even find circular gun loops appearing in the late medieval period, small, round holes designed for the early hand cannons and arquebuses that began to appear on the battlefield. This constant adaptation is a clear record of an arms race etched in stone, with window design struggling to keep pace with the development of new and more powerful projectile weapons. Beyond the arrow slit, other window-like features served even more grim defensive purposes. The aptly named murder hole was often located just above a gatehouse or passageway. While not a window in the traditional sense, it was an opening designed to exploit verticality for defense. From these openings, defenders could rain down a horrifying assortment of projectiles on anyone who managed to breach the outer doors: boiling water, hot sand, quicklime, or heavy stones. The psychological effect was as important as the physical one. The very presence of these dark openings in a ceiling created a sense of dread and vulnerability for any attacker forced to pass beneath them. This blend of psychological warfare and brutal practicality shows just how deeply the mindset of defense was woven into every architectural decision. This relentless focus on custom defense is the ultimate reason why no two defensive windows are ever truly identical. A castle on the stormy coast of Wales, facing the threat of longbowmen, would have a different arrangement and style of arrow slits than a tower in the south of France, which might be more concerned with repelling cavalry charges or siege engines. The local stone, the builder's particular experience, the specific topography of the hill upon which the fortress was built, all of these factors conspired to make every defensive solution unique. A window was never just a window. It was a calculated response to a very specific set of dangers, a frozen moment in a long-forgotten conflict, and a life-saving innovation carved directly into the fortress walls. Yet even as these stone fortresses perfected the art of earthly defense, a different kind of strength was being expressed through windows of an entirely opposite nature. Stepping from the grim, shadowy interior of a castle keep into the vast space of a medieval cathedral is like moving from a world of fear into a universe of faith. Here, the window was not designed to repel or threaten, but to inspire and enlighten. In these sacred spaces, the architecture of light became the primary medium for communicating the divine to a population that, for the most part, could not read the scriptures for themselves. Stained glass windows became known as the Bible of the poor, not as a term of condescension, but as a recognition of their power to make complex theological concepts visible, tangible, and breathtakingly beautiful. A single window could tell the story of a martyr's sacrifice, the genealogy of Christ, or the joys of heavenly salvation through a vibrant mosaic of colored glass and leading, transforming sunlight itself into a medium for preaching. This spiritual messaging was often encoded right into the very shape of the window opening itself. The most profound example is the cruciform arrow slit, a feature we just discussed for its military utility. But in a monastic context or a church tower, this same shape took on a radically different meaning. For a monk standing watch, the cross-shaped opening was a constant physical reminder of the faith he was protecting. It framed the outside world through the symbol of his devotion, transforming a defensive act into a meditative one. Beyond slits, the grander windows above were frequently designed with trefoil, three-lobed or quatrefoil, four-lobed patterns at their apex. These weren't mere decorations. The trefoil was a direct reference to the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while the quatrefoil could represent the four evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, spreading the gospel to the four corners of the earth. Every glance upward reinforced a core doctrine of the faith through simple, elegant geometry. The alignment of these windows was a science of sacred timing. Architects and clerics worked in concert to orient entire buildings precisely on an east-west axis. The primary altar was placed at the eastern end so that during the most important morning mass, the rising sun would stream directly through the windows behind it, illuminating the ceremony in a dramatic burst of natural light. This was no accident. It was a powerful symbol of the resurrection of Christ as the light of the world breaking through the darkness. On specific feast days, this effect could be even more precise. A window might be positioned so that a single shaft of light would land on a particular carving or altar item only on the anniversary of a saint's death, creating a miraculous annual event that bound the community to the liturgical calendar and the rhythms of the heavens themselves. The window acted as a kind of architectural clock and calendar, marking holiest moments with divine illumination. Furthermore, the specific design of a window could announce the very identity of the community that worshipped within. A monastery of the Cistercian order, for example, which prized extreme austerity and purity, would famously have plain, clear glass or grisaille windows, a monochromatic style using mainly shades of gray and white. This was a deliberate rejection of distraction, a way to use light purely for contemplation without the narrative complexity of colorful figures. Conversely, a wealthy Benedictine abbey might boast vibrant scenes of abundance and learning, reflecting their different values. A chapel dedicated to St. George would feature windows depicting his legendary battle with the dragon, while one honoring St. Catherine might show her with the wheel of her martyrdom. This customization meant that even from the outside, a knowledgeable observer could read a building's spiritual affiliations and dedications simply by studying the stories told in its glass and stone, each structure proclaiming its own unique devotional focus to the world. But while faith could offer a form of equality in the eyes of God, the earthly reality of medieval society was built upon a foundation of rigid, unyielding hierarchy. This social order wasn't just written in law or proclaimed by heralds. It was etched permanently into the very stone of the landscape, and perhaps no architectural feature communicated status more immediately and universally than the window. In a world where the vast majority lived in simple, dark dwellings, the ability to command light itself was the ultimate luxury. A window, therefore, was far more than an architectural component. It was a blatant, undeniable declaration of wealth, power, and social class for all to see. Consider the stark contrast between the homes of the peasantry and the castles of the nobility. For the common farmer or artisan, a window was a liability. Their dwellings, often made of wattle and daub, a mix of woven sticks and mud, or rough-hewn timber, could not support large openings without compromising the structure's integrity. More importantly, glass was prohibitively expensive, a luxury item utterly out of reach. Their windows were likely nothing more than small, square openings high on the wall, perhaps covered with a scrap of oiled cloth or a wooden shutter to keep out the worst of the weather. These openings let in smoke from the central hearth and provided minimal ventilation, but they admitted very little light, leaving the interior in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. For them, a window was a functional necessity, not a statement. It was about survival, not show. Now, lift your gaze to the local lord's castle or the bishop's palace. Here, the message was one of overwhelming abundance and control. The number of windows alone was a powerful indicator. A great hall might have an entire wall of large, arched windows, a breathtaking extravagance that screamed of resources. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a demonstration of power over physics and finance. Building such large openings required immensely thick walls and sophisticated engineering to support the weight of the structure above, a feat only vast wealth and a large workforce of skilled laborers could achieve. Then came the cost of glazing. Filling these vast openings with panes of glass, especially colored stained glass, was one of the most expensive parts of constructing a grand building. The patron was literally pouring money into the walls, transforming sunlight into a dazzling display of their financial and political capital. The larger and more numerous the windows, the more powerful the owner. The specific style of those windows acted as a refined language for those who could read it. Simple, rounded arches were common, but the truly elite embraced the latest Gothic innovations. Elaborate stone tracery, the delicate, web-like patterns of stone that held the glass, was a particularly potent status symbol. The more complex the tracery, with flowing forms, intricate geometric patterns, or even heraldic shapes like shields and beasts, the more it showcased the patron's ability to hire the most talented and innovative stonemasons. Sculpted frames adorned with leaves, faces, or biblical figures added another layer of cost and artistry, turning the window into a portrait frame for the family's piety and taste. Even the ironwork, the sturdy yet elegant bars placed across the window for security, could be forged into decorative patterns, proving that even functional elements could be co-opted into the theater of status. This hierarchical language extended beyond the simple divide between noble and peasant. It created a precise pecking order within the castle itself. The lord and lady's private chambers would feature the largest and best-appointed windows, often with built-in stone seats within the deep embrasures, creating a cozy, well-lit private retreat. The great hall, where the lord entertained and dispensed justice, would have impressive windows to intimidate and impress visitors. In contrast, the rooms for servants, soldiers, or guests of lower rank would have progressively smaller, simpler, and fewer openings. You could literally navigate your way through a castle based on the quality of the light, moving from the dark, functional spaces of the workers into the radiant, airy domains of the ruler. Every window, in its size, style, and placement, was a carefully calculated piece of social propaganda, a constant, silent reminder to everyone of their fixed place in the world. While the universal language of power and faith shaped medieval windows, a closer look reveals a rich tapestry of regional dialects, traveling from the sun-drenched coasts of Italy to the rain-swept highlands of Scotland, the same functional element. The window was reinvented again and again, molded by the very earth it was built from and the unique culture of the people who lived there. This wasn't a continent of uniform castles, but a vibrant patchwork of local solutions, where geography, climate, and tradition conspired to ensure that a window in Normandy would never be mistaken for one in Bavaria. Consider the profound influence of local materials, the most immediate constraint on any builder's vision. In the limestone belt of France, particularly around the Isle-de-France region, the stone was fine-grained and easy to carve. This geological gift allowed French masons to pioneer the breathtaking flamboyant Gothic style, a term that literally means flame-like. Their windows exploded with incredibly intricate, flowing tracery that resembled flickering flames, an audacious display of stonework that would have been impossible with a coarser, more brittle stone. Cross the Channel into England, however, and you find a different story. Much English limestone is harder and less forgiving. This practicality, combined with a different aesthetic sensibility, gave rise to the perpendicular Gothic style. Here, the tracery became a grid of vertical and horizontal lines, strong, rational, and majestic in its orderly grandeur. It was a style born not just from taste, but from the very rock beneath the mason's feet. In regions without good building stone, like parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, half-timbered construction dominated. Here, the windows were literally framed in wood, creating a checkerboard effect of white plaster and dark timber, with casement windows that swung open, a stark contrast to the monumental stone lancets of a French cathedral. Climate was the other great architect, demanding adaptations that were matters of comfort and survival. In the colder, wind-blasted north, think Scotland, Scandinavia, the Baltic, windows were a thermal liability. The solution was the deep splayed embrasure. Walls were built massively thick, and the window opening was carved out like a tunnel, widest on the inside. This design served a brilliant dual purpose. It structurally stabilized the thick wall while creating a cozy alcove inside that could capture and retain precious heat from a fireplace. Often, these deep-set windows were fitted with inner wooden shutters and perhaps even heavy tapestries to block drafts, making them feel more like protected rooms within a room. Now journey south to the Mediterranean. Under the intense Italian or Spanish sun, the problem was not retaining heat but avoiding it. Windows here could be larger to promote crucial cross-ventilation, but they were often shaded by deep overhanging eaves, wooden lattices, or interior courtyards that funneled cool air. The focus was on managing light and heat, creating airy, shaded interiors that stood in direct opposition to the warm, enclosed chambers of the north. These regional styles became powerful markers of cultural identity. A traveling medieval merchant or pilgrim would have known they were in a new land long before they heard the language, simply by reading the architecture. The soaring, delicate lacework of a French rayonnant window spoke of a courtly, sophisticated culture centered on powerful monarchs and theologians. The sturdy, vertical emphasis of English perpendicular style reflected a more pragmatic, centralized kingdom. The colorful, ornate windows of Venetian palaces, blending Gothic pointed arches with Byzantine mosaics, told a story of a wealthy, maritime republic at the crossroads of East and West. This diversity is a beautiful contradiction to the modern idea of the Dark Ages. It reveals a continent teeming with innovation, where local communities responded to their environment with intelligence and creativity, leaving behind a legacy of stunning variety that still defines the character of European towns and cities today. Behind every stone frame and every shard of colored glass was not an anonymous laborer, but a master artisan. These were the medieval stonemasons and glaziers, individuals who possessed a level of skill that bordered on magic in an age before power tools and computer-aided design. They were the rock stars of their era, traveling from one grand project to the next, their expertise commanding respect and high wages. Their work was not about following a sterile, exact blueprint with machined perfection. Instead, it was a conversation between the craftsman, his materials, and the patron's vision. This intimate, hand-forged process is a fundamental reason why searching for two identical windows is a futile exercise. The human element, with all its subtle imperfections and brilliant flashes of creativity, was deliberately woven into the fabric of these structures. Consider the journey of a single stone for a window tracery. A master mason would first study the block of stone, understanding its grain, its hidden weaknesses, and its potential. Using a template, often a wooden pattern called a mold, he would begin to rough out the shape, but the template was a guide, not a dictator. The final act of carving, of adding the delicate finishing touches to a leaf, a face, or a geometric groove, was where his personal style emerged. The angle of his chisel, the depth of a cut, the decision to make a curve slightly more robust or more delicate, these were unconscious signatures of his hand. This is why even in a perfectly symmetrical window, where the left and right sides are meant to be mirror images, you will often find tiny, fascinating discrepancies. A flower might have an extra petal on one side. A demon's grin might be a touch more menacing on the other. These aren't mistakes, they are the ghostly fingerprints of the craftsman, a quiet declaration that this was made by a person, not a machine. This individuality was sometimes made explicit. In an age before copyright law, a mason's reputation was his most valuable asset. To claim their work and ensure future commissions, these artisans would often leave a hidden signature, a mark known as a banker mark on their stones. But beyond these simple identifying scratches, they might also weave a personal motif into the decoration, a specific type of flower they were known for, a particular style of drapery on a sculpted figure, or a whimsical creature tucked into a corner. If you were a wealthy patron hiring a master known for his exquisite depictions of dogs, you might find a beloved hound peeking out from the stonework of your new chapel window. A glazier working with the alchemy of colored glass and lead might develop a characteristic way of painting a facial expression or a particular shade of red that became his trademark. These subtle cues allowed connoisseurs of the time to identify not just the region a window came from, but sometimes the specific workshop or even the individual master who led the team. This system of craftsmanship fostered a culture of creative problem-solving and improvisation that standardized production could never allow. A mason might discover a flaw in the stone as he was carving, a stubborn hard spot or an unexpected soft vein. Instead of discarding the entire block, he would adapt his design on the fly, turning a potential weakness into a unique feature. Perhaps a planned sharp corner became a rounded one, or a decorative element was shifted slightly to avoid the imperfection. The glazier, facing a limited palette of glass colors due to supply issues, might invent a new pattern or arrangement that was even more beautiful than the original design. This flexibility was a superpower. It meant that every window was a live performance, a one-time collaboration between the artist's intention and the material's reality. The constraints of the design brief were not a cage, but a framework within which they could showcase their virtuosity, ensuring that the final product was always a unique synthesis of plan, personality, and happenstance. Of course, the very fabric of a medieval tower, the stone, wood, and glass itself held the ultimate veto power over any architect's grand vision. A master mason might dream of impossibly delicate stone tracery, but if the local quarry only yielded a coarse, crumbly sandstone, that dream would shatter on the drafting table. The story of medieval windows is, in many ways, a story of a constant and creative negotiation between human ambition and the stubborn reality of materials. Builders didn't have global supply chains. They had what the land provided, and their genius lay in listening to that land and coaxing from it the most beautiful and stable forms possible. The type of stone available was the single greatest determining factor in a window's design. In the golden age of Gothic architecture, the Île-de-France region of France sat upon a geological jackpot, immense deposits of fine-grained, creamy limestone. This calcaire was a mason's dream, It was soft enough to be carved with incredible precision when first quarried, yet it hardened upon exposure to air, gaining the strength to hold up those soaring walls. This material freedom is what allowed for the breathtaking flamboyant windows of places like Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, where the stonework between the glass looks less like a support structure and more like a delicate, petrified lace. The stone itself permitted such audacious artistry. Now travel to a region like Cornwall in England where the granite is king. Granite is brutally hard, incredibly durable, and notoriously difficult to carve with any fine detail. A mason working here wasn't going to waste weeks trying to sculpt flame-like tracery. The material fought back every step of the way. Instead, they embraced the granite's nature. Windows in these areas are powerful, austere statements. They feature bold, simple shapes, strong lancet arches, or simple rectangular openings with massive stone mullions. The beauty here isn't in intricate detail, but in the raw, muscular presence of the stone itself, a testament to building with the landscape, not against it. The journey of a single stone for a window frame is a fascinating tale of pre-industrial craftsmanship. It began with the quarrymen who used picks, wedges, and sheer brute force to extract blocks from the earth. These rough blocks were then transported to the lodge, the mason's workshop at the construction site. Here, a highly skilled hewer would use a broad chisel called a pitcher to knock off the worst irregularities, squaring the block. Then the real artistry began. The master mason would provide wooden templates called molds, which outline the precise curves and angles of the window's components, the arch stones, the mullions, the tracery. The mason would trace this pattern onto the stone and begin the painstaking process of cutting it to shape with a range of chisels and a mallet. But here's where the human variable entered. The template was a guide, not an absolute dictator. The final dressing of the stone, the subtle shaping of a curve or the finishing of a surface, was done by eye and by feel. The mason's individual skill, the specific angle of his chisel, even the hidden grain or a small flaw within the stone itself. All of these factors introduced tiny, unique variations. Even two stones meant to be identical twins, carved from the same template, would emerge from the workshop as fraternal twins at best, each bearing the unconscious signature of the craftsman's hand. This is why, even in the most symmetrical of windows, you can find delightful little discrepancies that announce its handmade heritage. And then there was the magic of glass, a material so expensive and complex that its very presence was a declaration of extreme wealth. Medieval glass was not the perfectly clear, uniform pane we know today. It was a volatile, organic substance. Soda or potash from burnt wood ash was mixed with silica from sand, and the resulting melt was colored by adding metallic oxides, cobalt for a deep blue, copper for a ruby red, manganese for a vibrant purple. This molten glass was then blown into a large cylinder, which was slit open and flattened into a sheet. This process inherently created inconsistencies. The glass varied in thickness, with each sheet having a unique texture, often containing tiny bubbles, streaks, and a slight ripple or tint. When a glazier received these sheets, his job was to assemble them into a narrative. He would cut the colored glass into shapes using a hot iron, then fit the pieces together like a puzzle, binding them with strips of lead called cames. The leading itself became part of the design, a black neural network that held the glowing cells of color in place. No two panels could ever be exactly the same because the material itself was alive with variation. The light passing through a medieval window wasn't just colored. It was filtered through a unique lens of imperfections, each bubble and ripple scattering the sunlight in a one-of-a-kind performance that changed with every passing hour. This wasn't a bug of the system, it was a feature, a collaboration between human artistry and the beautiful unpredictability of nature. but the mastery of medieval architects went far beyond simply punching holes in walls to let the sunshine in. They were, in a very real sense, the original lighting designers, conducting the sun itself with stone and glass. They possessed a deep, almost intuitive understanding of solar geometry, carefully choreographing the dance of light and shadow within their buildings to serve a symphony of purposes: practical, spiritual, and psychological. A great hall needed to be a beacon of communal life, awash with light, while a private scriptorium demanded a focused, steady beam for meticulous work. A lady's chamber might call for a soft, diffused glow, and a chapel required a dramatic, soul-stirring performance of colored luminosity. Each of these vastly different lighting effects was achieved not with a switch, but with the precise size, shape, placement, and orientation of every single window, making each one a custom-built portal for the sun. This solar calculation began with the building's very footprint. Before a single foundation stone was laid, the master mason would have spent days, perhaps even weeks, on the site. He would note the path of the sun across the sky at different times of the year, observing how the low winter sun reached farther into a space than the high, blazing summer sun. This knowledge directly dictated the building's orientation. The most important rooms, especially those meant for gathering and ceremony, were almost invariably placed on the south-facing side of a structure in the northern hemisphere. Here, they could capture the greatest amount of sunlight throughout the day, particularly during the shorter, colder winter months when light and warmth were most precious. The deep window seats built into the thick walls of these south-facing openings became coveted sunny retreats, capturing and storing solar heat like a thermal battery, offering a warm spot to sit even on a chilly day. Conversely, north-facing rooms, which received little to no direct sunlight, were often relegated to storage, staircases, or other utilitarian functions where constant light was not a priority. This wasn't guesswork, it was applied solar science. The shape of the window opening itself was a powerful tool for manipulating light quality. A tall, narrow lancet window, so characteristic of early Gothic architecture, acted like a laser beam. It channeled an intense, concentrated shaft of light deep into the interior, perfect for illuminating a specific point like an altar, a statue, or a king's throne, making it stand out with dramatic emphasis. As Gothic design evolved and windows grew wider, the single lancet often gave way to groupings of 2, 3, or more, separated by slender stone mullions. This created a series of parallel light beams, painting the floor with a rhythmic pattern of light and shadow that moved slowly throughout the day like a celestial clock. The advent of elaborate traceried windows with their complex webs of stone took this even further. These windows didn't just admit light, they filtered it, fracturing a single beam into dozens of smaller, dancing points that created a dynamic, ever-changing pattern on the walls and floor, turning the entire room into a living, light-filled sculpture. The time of day and the season dictated an entirely different experience within the same room. In the morning, light from an eastern window would pour in, fresh and full of potential, brilliantly illuminating the interior. By noon, the high summer sun might blaze directly overhead, necessitating temporary awnings or tapestries to soften the glare, while the low winter sun would stretch long, golden rays across the floor. As evening approached, western windows would capture the fiery, horizontal light of sunset, casting long, dramatic shadows and bathing the space in a warm, melancholic glow. This daily cycle meant that a medieval interior was never static. Its character, mood, and even its perceived size were in a constant state of flux, orchestrated by the carefully placed windows. The inhabitants lived their lives in rhythm with this natural light, rising with the sun, conducting business in the bright height of the day, and retiring as darkness fell, their daily rhythms intimately tied to the architectural manipulation of the world's oldest and most beautiful light source. While the grand cathedrals of France reached for the heavens with walls of glass, a master builder in the Scottish Highlands or the sun-baked hills of Italy faced a completely different set of challenges dictated not by scripture, but by the weather itself. Medieval architecture wasn't created in a vacuum. It was in a constant, intimate dialogue with its environment. The window, that most vital connection between the interior and the exterior world, became the primary tool in this conversation. Far from a one-size-fits-all approach, its design was a masterclass in local adaptation, a testament to how these builders intuitively understood principles of sustainability and comfort centuries before the terms were ever coined. They couldn't control the climate, so they designed brilliant passive solutions to work with it, turning the window into a sophisticated environmental regulator. In the harsh, wind-lashed climates of Northern Europe, think of a stone tower on a Scottish loch or a fortress on the North Sea. A window was fundamentally a thermal liability. Primary goal was not to let light in, but to keep the bitter cold and damp out. The solution was brilliantly simple and effective: the deep splayed embrasure. Walls in these regions were built exceptionally thick, often several feet of solid stone. The window opening was then carved out like a tunnel, with the exterior opening being very narrow but splaying dramatically wider on the interior side of the wall. This design was a stroke of genius. Structurally, it stabilized the massive weight of the wall above the opening. Environmentally, it created a multi-functional buffer zone. The deep alcove captured precious heat from a room's central fireplace, acting as a thermal trap that warmed the stone seats often built into it. These window seats became the coziest spots in the castle, a sunny refuge even on a frigid day. To further combat the cold, these openings were almost always fitted with heavy, inward-opening wooden shutters, and often had hooks or rods above them from which thick woolen or tapestried curtains could be hung at night, adding another insulating layer against the drafts that would whistle through the narrow outer slit. The entire assembly was a layered defense against the elements, prioritizing warmth and shelter above all else. Now travel 1,000 miles south to the Mediterranean coast. Here, the architectural problem flipped entirely. Under the intense, relentless Italian or Spanish sun, the challenge was not to retain heat, but to avoid it. The enemy was stagnation and stuffiness, and the window was the primary weapon for ventilation. Openings in these regions could be much larger and more numerous to promote crucial cross-ventilation, but they were rarely just gaping holes. They were carefully managed. Deeply overhanging wooden eaves or stone hood molds projected above windows to shade them from the high summer sun, while still allowing the lower, warmer light of winter to penetrate. Intricate wooden lattices or mashrabiyah in regions influenced by Islamic architecture were fitted over openings. These beautiful screens allowed air to flow freely while diffusing the harsh direct sunlight into a soft, dappled glow, maintaining privacy and cooling the interior through evaporation. Courtyards were the heart of these southern buildings, and their design was all about funneling cool air. Windows opening onto these shaded inner courtyards would be left open to draw in the cooler air that pooled there, while higher-up openings on the opposite wall would allow the hot air to escape, creating a natural and continuous cooling airflow through the building without a single watt of electricity. Coastal and humid regions presented their own unique nightmares of maintenance and durability. In a castle perched on the Welsh coast, the constant salt spray and hurricane-force winds could erode soft stone and tear a building apart. Windows in these locations were not just narrow, they were often deeply recessed and sometimes protected by additional outer shutters made of thick, weather-resistant oak, reinforced with iron bands. The goal was to present the smallest possible profile to the gales. In the damp, misty climates of Ireland or parts of France, the relentless moisture was a silent destroyer, leading to rot, mold, and the crumbling of mortar. Windows here played a key role in moisture management. The same deep embrasures that trapped heat also prevented driving rain from directly reaching the interior wall surfaces. The sloped sills on the outside of windows were meticulously designed to shed water away from the wall as quickly as possible. Builders might also SELECT Chinese letter types of stone for the window surrounds that were less porous and more resistant to water damage, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of their materials' properties in the face of environmental stress. This wasn't just building, it was a form of architectural empathy, a deep-seated understanding that a structure must breathe with its environment, managing humidity and weathering the storms, both literal and metaphorical, through intelligent design. But this drive to encode meaning in stone went far beyond the functional shape of an arrow slit or the grand narratives of stained glass. It seeped into the very bones of the window itself, into the delicate, stone-carved webs that held the glass aloft. This is the world of tracery, and to the medieval mind, these intricate patterns were far more than mere decoration. They were a sacred geometry, a visual theology etched in limestone and light, a direct reflection of a universe believed to be perfectly ordered by a divine mathematician. When you look up at the rose window of a cathedral, you are not just seeing a beautiful design, you are reading a complex cosmological diagram, a map of heaven itself. The most fundamental elements of this language were deceptively simple shapes, each one a vessel overflowing with meaning. The trefoil, a shape with 3 overlapping circles creating a clover-like form, was one of the most potent and immediate symbols. In a culture steeped in Trinitarian doctrine, the belief in God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as 3 persons in one, the trefoil was a perfect, elegant representation. It visually captured the concept of 3 in 1, a unity within a plurality. You find it everywhere, from the tiny, punched-out shapes in the stonework of a chapter house to the grand, overarching design of a window's apex. It was a constant, subtle reminder of the core mystery of the faith, a shape that preached without words. Then there was the quatrefoil, its 4-lobed form echoing the 4 directions of the compass, the 4 seasons, and most importantly, the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A window adorned with quatrefoils was effectively signed by the authors of the Gospels, its very structure proclaiming that the light and the story shining through it came from their testimony, meant to be spread to the 4 corners of the earth. As Gothic architecture matured, these simple shapes began to combine and multiply into breathtakingly complex patterns, and the symbolism deepened accordingly. The rose window, the crowning glory of many a cathedral facade, is the ultimate example. Its very form is a solar symbol, a massive stone-wheeled sun bursting with light, often explicitly dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who was herself frequently described in liturgy as a rose without thorns and the woman clothed with the sun. But look closer at its construction. The radiating spokes dividing the window often number 12, a direct reference to the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes of Israel, and the 12 signs of the zodiac, weaving together biblical history and the perceived order of the cosmos into a single, unified vision. The concentric circles moving out from the center could represent the heavenly hierarchies, with Christ or the Lamb of God at the very center, and the rings of angels, saints, and prophets radiating outward. It was a complete picture of the medieval universe, microcosm and macrocosm, all contained within the circumference of a window. This obsession with geometric perfection wasn't just pious poetry. It was rooted in a very serious intellectual tradition. Medieval scholars were deeply influenced by ancient Greek thinkers like Plato and Pythagoras, who believed that the universe was constructed according to perfect mathematical ratios, and that number was the language of God. This concept, known as the harmony of the spheres, suggested that the planets themselves moved in accordance with divine musical and mathematical principles. For the master mason designing a window, this wasn't abstract philosophy. It was a practical design manual. He would use a compass and a straightedge, the tools of geometry, literally, earth measuring, to lay out his patterns, basing his designs on perfect squares, circles, and triangles. The ratios he used, like the famous golden ratio found throughout nature, were believed to be a glimpse into the mind of the creator. By building these ratios into his window, the mason was quite literally building a piece of the divine order into the cathedral. The window wasn't just pointing toward heaven, it was a little piece of heavenly order brought down to earth, a fragment of cosmic harmony made visible in stone and light. This deep, symbolic purpose is the final, definitive answer to why no two windows are truly alike. While two churches might both want a window dedicated to the Trinity, the master mason in Chartres might express it through a soaring, vertical lancet with a trefoil crown, his design constrained by the local stone and influenced by the latest French theological debates. His counterpart in York, however, might interpret the same brief through the lens of the English perpendicular style, creating a much broader window where the trefoil is contained within a grid of strong vertical lines, reflecting a different aesthetic and perhaps a different emphasis within the same doctrine. The choice of pattern became a dialect within the larger language of faith. A Cistercian abbey, in its stark purity, might use only the most austere and simple geometric forms, seeing elaborate flamboyant tracery as a sinful distraction. A wealthy town's guild church, wanting to show off its prosperity and learning, might commission the most complex and intellectually dazzling patterns money could buy. Each tracery pattern, therefore, is a unique theological statement, a frozen sermon in stone that tells us not just what the builders believed, but how they chose to think about it, making every window a distinct chapter in the endless, glorious attempt to capture the infinite within the finite confines of human craftsmanship. Yet for all their celestial ambition, these luminous pages were also deeply grounded in the earthly realities of power, patronage, and identity. A stained glass window was an incredibly expensive undertaking, requiring not just master glaziers but also costly materials like cobalt for blue and gold for red. The narrative depicted was therefore never a neutral choice. It was a direct reflection of the person or group who paid for it. A wealthy noble family might commission a window showing their patron saint prominently protecting them, a not-so-subtle reminder to the entire congregation of their piety and influence. A prosperous merchants' guild, like the shoemakers or the wool weavers, would often fund a window illustrating the life of their own patron saint, subtly advertising the importance of their trade to the community's well-being. In this way, the windows of a cathedral became a visual ledger of its funding, a kaleidoscopic tapestry of donors all vying for a piece of divine real estate and a permanent place in the public eye. The stories told were as much about securing social and spiritual status in the present as they were about recounting sacred history from the past. The language of these stories was written in a vibrant and deliberate color palette, where every hue carried a specific theological and symbolic weight. This was not a naturalistic art form trying to replicate the world as it appeared. It was a symbolic language aiming to reveal a higher, divine truth. The color blue, made with precious cobalt, was universally associated with the heavens, divinity, and the Virgin Mary, often used for her robes to signify her celestial purity. A rich, deep red created with copper compounds symbolized the blood of Christ, the passion of the martyrs, and the fire of the Holy Spirit. It was the color of sacrifice and divine love. Green represented life, rebirth, and the triumph of spring over winter, frequently used in scenes of resurrection or for the garments of saints who brought new life to their communities. Even the use of clear or white glass was deeply intentional, often surrounding divine figures to suggest their radiance and purity was so intense it could not be contained by color. The glazier was like a poet selecting the perfect word, each piece of colored glass a syllable in a larger hymn of light. This narrative power transformed the very experience of being inside a medieval church. For the vast majority of congregants who could not read Latin or afford a handwritten Bible, these windows were their primary access to the foundational stories of their faith. The entire cycle of salvation history, from the creation and the fall of man in the book of Genesis, through the prophecies of the Old Testament, to the life, death, and resurrection of Christ in the New Testament, and finally to the Last Judgment, could all be read while standing in the nave. A worshipper could follow the story of David and Goliath along one window, then turn to see the miracles of Jesus in the next. The windows did more than just inform, they created an immersive, overwhelming sensory experience. On a bright day, the interior would be awash with pools of colored light that slowly migrated across the stone floors as the sun moved, making the stories themselves feel alive and dynamic. The entire space became a theater for the sacred drama, a place where one didn't just hear the word of God preached from the pulpit, but where one walked into it, was surrounded by it, and was literally illuminated by it. It was an architectural marvel that engaged the heart and the imagination long before it ever engaged the intellect. And because each community, each patron, and each glazier brought their own unique priorities, fears, and artistic sensibilities to these projects, the variations are endless. The same biblical parable might be depicted with stark, dramatic simplicity in a rural parish church, focusing on the raw emotional power of the story. That same story in a grand metropolitan cathedral might be encased in an elaborate framework of decorative borders, heraldic shields, and portraits of the bishop and king who funded it, layering the sacred narrative with contemporary political commentary. A window made in England during a time of plague might emphasize themes of mortality and divine judgment, its colors perhaps darker and more somber. One made in a time of peace and prosperity might burst with scenes of heavenly feasts and angelic musicians, its palette lighter and more celebratory. Each window is a time capsule, capturing not just a story from Scripture, but the hopes, anxieties, and identity of the very people who gazed upon it centuries ago, ensuring that their light-drenched stories would continue to speak long after their voices fell silent. This incredible journey of architectural evolution wasn't a sudden leap but a fascinating, centuries-long conversation between ambition and engineering, a story written in the changing shapes of windows themselves. To truly appreciate the diversity of medieval towers, we have to understand that they are not frozen in a single moment, but are often palimpsests layered with the handwriting of different eras. A single castle might have windows from 3 or 4 distinct centuries, each one a chapter in the ongoing saga of how builders learned to defy gravity and harness light. This progression begins with the formidable and earthbound Romanesque style, which dominated from around the year 1000 to the mid-12th century. Imagine structures that seem to grow directly from the ground, with immense, muscular walls built to convey a sense of permanence and security in a tumultuous world. The windows in these buildings are a direct reflection of that defensive, weighty philosophy. They are small, deeply set, and crowned with a solid, semicircular arch, a direct inheritance from the Romans. The reason for their modest size is purely structural. The walls are so thick and heavy to support the massive stone barrel vaults inside that large openings would have been a catastrophic weakness. Light in a Romanesque interior is a precious and scarce commodity, entering in thin, focused shafts that leave the vast spaces wrapped in a mysterious, contemplative gloom, perfectly suited to the spiritual atmosphere of the time. The turning point in this story, the moment the architectural world turned on its axis, came with a series of brilliant engineering breakthroughs that collectively created what we now call the Gothic Revolution. It started with a simple but profound shift in shape, the move from the rounded Romanesque arch to the elegant, upward-thrusting pointed arch. This wasn't just an aesthetic whim, it was a structural masterstroke. The pointed arch does a far more efficient job of channeling the immense weight of the stone above it down into the supporting pillars, rather than pushing outwards against the walls. This reduction in lateral thrust was the key that unlocked everything. Then came the ribbed vault, a skeleton of stone ribs that allowed the spaces between them to be filled with lighter material, making the ceiling both stronger and visually lighter. But the true hero of this narrative, the innovation that made the glass wall possible, was the flying buttress. This ingenious externalized skeleton acts like a series of stone braces, leaping away from the building to catch the outward thrust of the vaults and channel it safely into the ground. With the walls now freed from their primary job of holding everything up, they could effectively be dissolved into vast frameworks of stone, and the space between those frames could be filled with the most breathtaking innovation of all, immense narrative-stained glass windows. The entire architectural philosophy flipped from building heavy, defensive walls with tiny holes to creating a delicate, stone-framed cage for capturing and coloring divine light. This liberation of the wall led to an explosion of creativity in the very language of the window stone framework, known as tracery. Early Gothic windows, like those at Chartres Cathedral, often used what is called plate tracery. Here, the stonework still looks relatively solid, with shapes, circles, trefoils, quatrefoils seemingly punched out of a solid stone plate within the arch of the window. It's powerful, but it still speaks the language of mass and weight. The next evolutionary step was nothing short of a revolution in design: bar tracery. This is where the entire concept inverted. Instead of cutting holes in a solid field, bar tracery involves building the window's framework from individually cut stone bars or mullions, which then branch and curve at the top of the window to form intricate, delicate patterns. This was the birth of the great rose windows and the incredibly complex flowing designs of the later flamboyant Gothic style. With bar tracery, the stonework was no longer a barrier with holes. It became a delicate, web-like drawing in stone, a lacework that was both structure and art, allowing for previously unimaginable expanses of glass and complexity of pattern. Each new style of tracery, from the rigid geometric to the sinuous curvilinear and the flame-like flamboyant, marks a distinct moment in time, a new chapter in the technical and artistic confidence of the medieval mason. Consequently, exploring an ancient tower is often like walking through a living museum of these architectural eras. It was exceedingly common for older structures to be updated, modernized, and adapted to the new styles as they emerged. A Norman castle keep from the 11th century, originally built with those tiny, rounded Romanesque windows for defense, might have been retrofitted in the 14th century with larger, pointed Gothic windows in the Great Hall when the threat of siege had lessened and the desire for light and status had increased. You can see this clearly in buildings like Dover Castle in England, where different phases of construction are visible side by side. This practice of updating creates a fascinating architectural timeline on a single facade. A single church tower might have its lower levels with the original small Saxon or Norman openings, a middle section with early Gothic lancets added a century later, and the topmost belfry level with magnificent perpendicular Gothic windows installed during a final wave of construction in the 15th century. This means that the windows themselves are not a uniform set. They are a catalogue of changing tastes, technologies, and needs, each one representing the hopes and capabilities of the generation that installed it, all coexisting on a single, storied structure. Yet for all the divine inspiration and masterful craftsmanship, the stunning windows we admire today would never have risen beyond a dream without one crucial, earthbound element: cold, hard cash. Behind every pane of jewel-toned glass and every delicately carved stone mullion stood a patron, a wealthy individual or institution with the resources to turn architectural ambition into reality. This relationship between money and art transformed the window from a structural feature into a powerful medium of personal and political expression, where the message was often just as important as the medium. In the fiercely competitive world of medieval elite society, a grand window was more than a gift to God. It was a bold, permanent advertisement of one's piety, power, and prestige, designed to outshine rivals and secure a legacy carved in light. Consider the immense cost involved. Commissioning a major stained glass window for a cathedral was one of the most expensive acts of patronage possible, a financial undertaking comparable to funding a private space mission today. The process consumed staggering resources, the wages for a team of highly skilled master masons and glaziers for months or even years, the cost of quarrying, transporting, and carving vast quantities of fine stone, and most exorbitantly, the materials for the glass itself. The deep, brilliant blues required cobalt oxide, a mineral often imported from distant mines at great expense. The fiery, translucent reds were achieved with glass infused with tiny particles of gold, making it literally worth its weight in precious metal. By funding such a project, a patron wasn't just making a donation. They were engaging in an act of spectacular, luminous consumption, a public demonstration of wealth so vast they could literally pour treasure into a wall for the sake of beauty and devotion. This was the ultimate flex, a statement that echoed through the centuries. Naturally, such a significant investment came with strings attached. Patrons were far from passive benefactors. They were active art directors, meticulously dictating the content and style of their windows to ensure their personal message was broadcast to the entire community. The most common and direct method of claiming this spiritual real estate was through heraldry. A noble family's coat of arms would be prominently featured in the lower panels of a window, a permanent and brightly colored billboard announcing exactly who had paid for this slice of divinity. But they went much further than a simple shield. Elaborate border designs would be woven from their family colors and crests. Scenes from the Bible might be subtly adapted to include portraits of the donors themselves, kneeling piously at the foot of the cross, or presented to the Virgin Mary by their patron saint, inserting their likeness directly into the sacred narrative. Their personal mottos might be inscribed on scrolls winding through the imagery, and in some cases, entire windows were dedicated to the lives of their named saints, creating a permanent association between their family lineage and a specific holy figure. The window became a complex visual CV, detailing their lineage, their virtues, and their privileged relationship with the divine. This created a silent but intense competition played out across the walls of great cathedrals and churches. Walking down the nave was like walking through a gallery of the region's most powerful families, each window vying for attention, each trying to outdo the last in size, complexity, and brilliance. A bishop from a wealthy see might commission a massive new choir window to overshadow the older windows funded by local nobles, reasserting the church's primacy. A newly rich merchant guild, seeking social acceptance and spiritual favor, might fund a spectacular window to prove their piety was the equal of their financial success, directly challenging the established aristocracy's monopoly on sacred art. This rivalry drove innovation as patrons sought out the most famous and talented artists to create ever more dazzling displays, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with stone and glass. The cathedral became a battlefield of light and ego, where the weapons were pigment and piety, and the victory was a permanent place in the public eye, and they hoped in the heavenly ledger. The motivations behind these grand gestures were as layered as the lead cames holding the glass. Ostensibly, it was all done for the glory of God and the salvation of one's soul. Patrons genuinely believed that such a magnificent gift could earn them divine favor and shorten their time in purgatory, but the earthly benefits were equally compelling. For a king, funding a great window was an act of statecraft, a visual demonstration of his power and legitimacy as God's chosen ruler on earth. For a noble family, it was a tool for social climbing, a way to cement their status and remind everyone of their importance for generations to come. For a wealthy merchant or guild, it was an opportunity for reputation laundering, using cultural philanthropy to burnish their image and gain influence in a society that was often suspicious of new money. The window served all these masters at once. It was a prayer, a propaganda poster, a status symbol, and a piece of soul insurance, all fused together in a radiant, fragile, and breathtakingly expensive masterpiece of light. But the medieval window was a shapeshifter, its form exquisitely tailored to a staggering variety of roles that reached far beyond the basic needs of defense and devotion. While we've marveled at the lethal precision of the arrow slit and the soul-stirring spectacle of the stained glass narrative, architects of the era were also masters of domestic innovation, turning the humble window into a tool for comfort, status, and even psychological expansion within the often cramped and gloomy confines of a stone fortress. This incredible functional diversity is a testament to their ingenuity, proving that a single architectural element could be reinvented again and again to meet the complex demands of daily life. Take the oriel window, a brilliant innovation that fundamentally redefined the relationship between interior space and the outside world. Unlike a standard window set flush within a wall, an oriel is a projecting bay, a small room of light that cantilevers out from the upper stories of a building. Supported by elegant stone brackets or intricate wooden corbels that were often carved into fantastical beasts or foliate designs, the oriel was a declaration of luxury and architectural confidence. Its genius was multi-layered. Structurally, it added valuable square footage to a room without requiring any additional foundation, a crucial advantage in a crowded castle or a narrow urban street. But its true magic was experiential. By projecting outward, it allowed occupants to see not just a narrow slice of the world directly in front of them, but to gain a commanding, panoramic view down the street, into the courtyard, or over the surrounding countryside. For a noble lady overseeing the management of a household or a merchant conducting business, this was a powerful tool for observation and control. Furthermore, because it was exposed on three sides, it flooded the interior with light from multiple angles, banishing shadows and creating an airy, luminous retreat that felt worlds away from the dark, fortified chambers below. Often furnished with a built-in stone seat and cushioned with tapestries, the oriel became the ultimate status symbol nook, a private sanctuary for conversation, reading, or quiet contemplation, bathed in sunlight and floating above the everyday world. On the opposite end of the spectrum, but no less ingenious, was the humble yet vital unglazed opening for ventilation and smoke evacuation. In the great hall, the heart of castle life, a massive central hearth was the source of warmth, light, and cooking. But with that came an enormous amount of smoke. The solution was not a window in the traditional sense, but a strategic hole in the roof known as a louver or a smoke vent. Often topped with a small, turret-like structure that could be rotated to shield against rain while still letting smoke escape, this opening was as critical to comfort as any fireplace. In kitchens, buttery hatches, and storage areas, small, high-placed ventilation slits were essential for preserving food and preventing dampness and rot. These purely functional openings were designed with ruthless efficiency. No ornamentation, no expensive glass, just a simple, life-improving hole that speaks volumes about the medieval understanding of practical hygiene and air quality, concerns that were just as important as the more glamorous aspects of architectural design. And we cannot forget the purely symbolic function of windows designed not for looking through, but solely for being looked at. The rose window is the ultimate example of this. While it does admit light, its primary purpose is not illumination in a practical sense. Its function is to inspire awe, to serve as a colossal, radiant mandala representing the cosmic order of the universe, with Christ or the Virgin Mary at its center and the cycles of the liturgical year, the apostles, and the heavenly hierarchies radiating outward. It is theology translated into geometry and light, a focal point for worship that is entirely non-utilitarian in the conventional meaning of the word. Similarly, tiny, seemingly pointless decorative openings might be punched through a stairwell or a passageway. Their function wasn't to provide a view or light a room, but to break up the monotony of a massive stone wall, to create pleasing patterns of light and shadow, and to demonstrate the playful skill of the mason who could afford to add such a frivolous yet beautiful detail. This breathtaking range of purpose, from the life-saving crossbow loop to the soul-expanding rose window, from the smoke-venting louver to the status-projecting oriel, shows that the medieval mind saw the window not as a single solution, but as a versatile vocabulary. They used this vocabulary to write poems of defense, hymns of faith, sonnets of comfort, and love letters to light itself on the enduring pages of stone. Yet even the most perfectly positioned arrow slit was of little use if it could be easily shattered or sealed by an attacker. This constant threat demanded that windows be not just well placed, but also incredibly resilient and adaptable. In times of peace, a large window in the Great Hall was a symbol of status and comfort, flooding the space with light and air. But when the watchfires were lit on the horizon and a siege seemed imminent, that very same window became a critical vulnerability, a potential entry point for missiles, fire, or even determined soldiers. The medieval response to this duality was a masterclass in modular, multi-purpose design, transforming passive openings into active components of the castle's defensive system. Heavy internal wooden shutters, reinforced with iron bands, could be slammed shut and barred from the inside, instantly converting a glowing beacon of habitation into a dark, impregnable shell. These weren't flimsy decorations, they were stout barriers, often covered in wet hides as a further precaution against fire arrows. For the most vulnerable windows, especially those at ground level, stone masons designed ingenious convertible openings. A beautiful traceried window might have a massive, perfectly fitted stone block stored nearby, ready to be mortared into the embrasure at a moment's notice, permanently sealing the breach until the danger passed. This wasn't about permanent fortification. It was about dynamic response, the architectural equivalent of a knight donning his armor only when the trumpet sounded for battle. The evolution of siege technology acted as a relentless driver for innovation in window defense. The advent of the trebuchet, a fearsome counterweight engine capable of hurling massive stones with terrifying accuracy, meant that simply having a shutter was no longer enough. Windows, particularly those in high-status rooms that were naturally larger, now needed to withstand direct impacts. This led to the development of immensely strong iron grills, or fenestrals, which were set deep into the stonework on the outside of the window opening. These were not the delicate decorative bars we might imagine today, but thick, wrought iron masterpieces of the blacksmith's art, often woven into complex geometric patterns that could deflect and absorb the energy of a projectile while still allowing light and air to filter through. In coastal castles or those facing constant low-level raiding, these grills became a permanent feature, a visible statement that the inhabitants lived under a perpetual state of watchfulness. The design of these barriers themselves evolved. Some were hinged to swing inward for cleaning or in times of peace, while others were fixed, their formidable presence a permanent reminder of the ever-present threat of violence. Perhaps the most aggressive and psychologically terrifying adaptation was the integration of windows with machicolations. This involved extending the castle wall outward from the top of a tower or above a gateway to create a stone gallery, the floor of which was made of open slots. When a window or arrow slit was located directly beneath one of these projecting galleries, it created a nightmarish scenario for any attacker who dared to approach the base of the wall. Defenders could stand safely on the machicolated floor and, through the slots, directly target the area right below them, a zone that was otherwise a perfect blind spot, completely immune to fire from standard vertical arrow slits. From these openings, they could rain down a horrifying assortment of missiles, not just arrows but heavy stones, boiling water, quicklime that blinded and burned, or even caustic lime mixed with boiling oil. The very presence of these dark, overhanging stone boxes above a window sent a clear, brutal message to any besieging force. There is no safe place to hide, and every inch of ground around this fortress is a killing zone. This combination of defensive window and offensive machicolation represents the pinnacle of medieval defensive thinking, a seamless merging of architectural forms designed for maximum lethal efficiency. This relentless pressure to adapt created a fascinating geographical map of window design across Europe. A tranquil manor deep within the heart of a peaceful kingdom might boast wonderfully large, ornate windows with minimal defensive features, reflecting a life of relative security and comfort. But travel to a contested borderland like the volatile marches between England and Wales or the war-torn frontiers of Christian and Muslim Spain, and the architecture tells a completely different story. Here, every single window, from the highest chamber to the lowest cellar, was designed with a paranoid intensity. Towers in these regions are often described as blind, their lower levels featuring only the narrowest, most well-protected slits, while any larger openings are reserved for the uppermost floors, far from the reach of ladders and siege towers. The windows themselves are often splayed inward at extreme angles, not for light, but to provide a wider field of fire downward onto the approaches. The variation from region to region, from castle to castle, and even from one side of a castle to another, is a direct physical record of perceived threat. A window facing a steep cliff might be larger and more decorative, while one overlooking the only feasible approach for an army would be a minimalist, brutalist masterpiece of defensive design. Each unique configuration is a frozen calculation of risk, a permanent testament to the specific fears and strategic realities faced by the people who built it and called it home. Now let's explore a dimension of medieval windows that often goes completely unnoticed by the modern eye, yet it would have been a powerful, ever-present force in the daily life of a castle or cathedral, the world of sound. We've seen how windows were engineered for defense, crafted for status, and designed to conduct light, but their role as architectural instruments for shaping sound is a hidden masterpiece of acoustic innovation. In an age before electronic amplification, the control of sound was a critical yet silent partner to the control of light, and the humble window embrasure was one of the medieval mason's most versatile tools for conducting the symphony of daily life. Consider the challenge faced in a vast, stone-built great hall. These cavernous spaces, with their high, vaulted ceilings and hard, reflective surfaces, were natural echo chambers. While this could add a sense of grandeur to a king's proclamation, it could also turn a simple conversation into an unintelligible rumble of overlapping noise. This is where the deep, splayed design of a window embrasure revealed a surprising secondary function. That funnel-shaped opening didn't just manage light and provide a cozy seat. It acted as a primitive but highly effective sound baffle. The irregular, angled stone surfaces of the deep reveal helped to break up and diffuse sound waves, preventing them from bouncing directly back into the room and creating a disruptive echo. By strategically placing these acoustic traps around the hall, builders could subtly dampen the reverberation, making it easier for commands to be understood, for conversations to be held, and for the intricate layers of music performed during a feast to remain distinct and clear. The window was quietly working to make the space not just visually magnificent, but also functionally audible. But this acoustic manipulation could also be flipped to achieve the opposite effect: amplification. In the long, narrow chapels of monasteries and castles, where monks would chant the divine offices hours each day, projection was essential. A window embrasure facing the interior of the chapel could be carefully shaped to act as a resonating chamber, subtly catching and boosting the human voice. A singer standing within or near such an embrasure might find their voice lifted and carried farther down the aisle, as the stone surfaces reflected and focused the sound waves forward rather than allowing them to dissipate upwards into the vaults. This wasn't magic, it was an intuitive application of acoustic physics, learned through centuries of trial and error. The builders were essentially turning the very fabric of the building into a giant, stationary musical instrument, with each window alcove a carefully tuned component designed to support the human voice in its sacred duties. The placement and size of windows also played a crucial role in managing the soundscape between the inside and the outside world. In a lord's private solar or a lady's chamber where privacy was paramount, a smaller window with a deep, convoluted embrasure would do more than just keep out drafts. It would also severely muffle the sounds of the busy courtyard below, creating a much-needed auditory sanctuary from the constant clamor of medieval life. Conversely, in a gatehouse or watchtower, the specific design of an arrow slit was about more than sight lines. Its narrow, tapered form could help funnel specific sounds from outside, like the distant clip-clop of approaching horses, the rumble of a cart, or even a hushed conversation just below the wall, making it easier for a guard to identify potential threats by ear long before he could see them clearly. The window became an early warning system, a stone ear pressed against the outside world. This sophisticated, if instinctive, understanding of sound reveals a layer of medieval life that we can easily overlook. We tend to imagine these spaces in the hushed reverence of a modern museum, but they were vibrantly, sometimes deafeningly, alive with noise. The clash of practice swords in the yard, the bellowing of livestock, the chatter of servants, the ringing of bells, and the constant drift of sung prayer. In designing windows to manage this cacophony, the medieval mason was acting as an acoustic engineer. He was ensuring that a commander's orders in the hall would not be lost in a muddy reverberation, that the sacred chants in the chapel would rise clearly to the heavens, and that moments of quiet contemplation could be found even in the heart of a bustling fortress. It's a profound reminder that these buildings were designed not just as static sculptures to be seen, but as dynamic environments to be lived in and experienced with all the senses, where every opening served a chorus of purposes, conducting both light and sound to shape the experience of those within. Yet for all their regional distinctiveness, the story of medieval windows is not one of isolated cultures developing in a vacuum. It is, perhaps surprisingly, a powerful testament to an early form of globalization, a vibrant narrative of cross-cultural conversation conducted not with words but with stone and light. The common image of the Middle Ages as a time of walled-in isolation is shattered by the evidence in the very walls themselves. Through the relentless engines of trade, the fraught encounters of the Crusades, and the delicate negotiations of diplomacy, medieval Europe found itself in a constant, if often complicated, dialogue with the Byzantine Empire to its east and the Islamic Caliphates to its south. And the architects were listening, their eyes keenly fixed on the artistic and engineering marvels they witnessed, which they then eagerly absorbed, adapted, and reinvented into something uniquely their own. A window, therefore, is often far more than it appears. It can be a silent ambassador from a distant land, a permanent record of a cultural encounter that happened centuries ago. Nowhere is this beautiful, complex intermingling more vividly displayed than on the Iberian Peninsula, in the stunning hybrid style known as mudéjar. This term refers to the art and architecture created by Muslims who remained in Christian-controlled territories after the Reconquista, and it represents one of the most creative and lasting fusions in architectural history. Here, on the same soil where Christian and Muslim armies had clashed for centuries, their cultures achieved a breathtaking synthesis in stone. Christian kings, having conquered magnificent cities like Seville and Toledo, were so captivated by the sophisticated beauty of Islamic architecture that they actively commissioned Muslim craftsmen to build and decorate their palaces and churches. The result is a style where the fundamental structure of the building might be a sturdy European Gothic, but its soul is undeniably infused with an Islamic aesthetic. Look at the windows in a mudéjar building, and you will see this dialogue play out. The pointed Gothic arch might be present, but it is framed by an intricate, blind arcade of muqarnas, those mesmerizing honeycomb-like vaults that seem to drip from the ceiling. The stone tracery between the glass doesn't form the flowing curves of French flamboyant, but instead resolves into precise, infinitely repeating geometric patterns, interlocking stars, and complex arabesques that celebrate the infinite wisdom of God through mathematics rather than figurative storytelling. This was not mere copying, it was a profound act of cultural translation, creating a new visual language that belonged to both worlds, and yet was entirely unique to Spain. The influence flowed through other channels as well. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought back more than just relics and scars. They carried with them a new visual vocabulary seared into their memories. They had seen the grandeur of Islamic palaces with their grand horseshoe arches and the serene beauty of Byzantine churches shimmering with gold-backed mosaics. A Norman knight building a new church back in England or Sicily might insist on incorporating the tall, elegant pointed arch he had seen in the Near East, an architectural form that would become the very engine of the Gothic Revolution. In the wealthy maritime republics of Venice and Ravenna, a constant, centuries-long economic and diplomatic relationship with Byzantium meant that the classical and Eastern influences were never truly lost. The windows of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, for instance, are not just openings for light. They are set amidst walls covered in dazzling mosaics of emperors and saints, a technique and aesthetic directly imported from Constantinople. This created a unique Byzantine Romanesque style where the heavy, rounded arches of the West are adorned with the luminous, heavenly gold of the East, each window looking out from a wall that itself resembles a vision of the celestial kingdom. This cross-pollination meant that every unique window design became a frozen moment of cultural contact. A trefoil shape in a French cathedral might be a purely Christian symbol of the Trinity, but the same shape appearing in the stonework of a Sicilian Norman palace could also be a nod to the three-lobed motifs popular in Islamic art from the same period. It becomes impossible to untangle the threads of influence, and that is precisely the point. These were not passive borrowings, they were active choices. A patron or mason saw something beautiful, something innovative, or something spiritually powerful in the art of a different culture, and they chose to make it their own, recontextualizing it to fit their own needs and beliefs. This turns the search for a pure style into a fool's errand. The medieval world was deeply interconnected, and its greatest architectural achievements were often the brilliant, unexpected children of that interconnection. The window, in its graceful arch, its intricate tracery, and its radiant glass, stands as a lasting monument to a time when ideas, like light itself, refused to be contained by any border, flowing freely and transforming everything they touched. Yet for all the careful calculations of defense and the grand statements of faith, the medieval mind also navigated a world alive with unseen forces, where danger could lurk not just in the form of a rival army, but in a stray glance, an ill wind, or the malignant influence of a wandering spirit. This deeply ingrained worldview, a rich tapestry of superstition, folklore, and pre-Christian belief, left its own unique fingerprints on the architecture, ensuring that a window's design was sometimes less about physics and more about phantoms. Beyond their roles as instruments of war and light, these openings were also considered thresholds, vulnerable points where the safe, ordered interior of a home or church met the chaotic, spirit-filled outside world. This perception demanded a different kind of protection, one woven from symbol, story, and ritual, turning the window into a powerful talisman against misfortune. The very placement of a window could be a decision fraught with supernatural consequence. Across Europe, regional folk traditions often held strong beliefs about the directions from which good or evil influences might travel. A common fear rooted in ancient lore was of the evil eye or malevolent spirits arriving on a particular wind. In some areas, it was considered profoundly unlucky to place the main window of a house facing north, the direction associated with cold, darkness, and death in the long winter months. A north-facing opening was seen as an invitation for chill and sickness, both literal and spiritual, to seep into the home. Conversely, a window oriented to capture the morning sun from the east was universally favored, welcoming the light of renewal, health, and positive energy associated with the dawn. Builders and homeowners alike might consult almanacs, local wise women, or astrological charts not just for the best time to build, but for the most auspicious alignment for every opening, seeking to harmonize their dwelling with invisible cosmic currents for the well-being of those inside. This need for spiritual protection gave rise to some of the most iconic and enduring architectural features of the era, the gargoyle and the grotesque. While we often use these terms interchangeably, there is a subtle distinction. A gargoyle is specifically a functional waterspout designed to channel rainwater away from the masonry of a wall through its often grotesquely gaping mouth. A grotesque is a purely decorative carving of a fantastical beast, demon, or hybrid creature, but both served a powerful apotropaic function, that is, they were intended to ward off evil. The logic was brilliantly symbolic. By carving these terrifying figures and placing them on the rooflines, corners, and especially near windows and doorways, medieval builders were essentially fighting fire with fire. They were populating the exterior of their sacred and important buildings with a protective army of stone monsters, whose fearsome visages were believed to scare away any malicious spirits approaching the building. The message was clear: if even the guardians looked this terrifying, imagine what must be waiting inside. This spiritual sentry duty transformed the building's silhouette into a defensive perimeter as active in the metaphysical realm as the arrow slits were in the physical one. The protective symbolism extended beyond sculpture and into the very shapes carved into the stonework around the window itself. Stonemasons, who were custodians of a vast repertoire of symbolic knowledge, frequently incorporated specific motifs believed to possess inherent protective power. The most common of these was the simple zigzag or chevron pattern, a shape that appears in Romanesque architecture with a frequency that suggests more than just decoration. In many folk traditions, the zigzag, reminiscent of lightning or a serpent's movement, was believed to be apotropaic, confusing and repelling evil spirits who were thought to travel only in straight lines. Interlaced knots and complex geometric patterns, styles that harken back to pre-Christian Celtic and Germanic art, were also common. These endless, looping designs with no beginning and no end were thought to trap and confuse evil spirits, preventing them from entering the opening they surrounded. Even a seemingly decorative billet molding a row of short, cylindrical blocks might have been intended to represent a row of protective symbols or miniature totems, a repeated ritual barrier etched in stone around the vulnerable void of the window. These practices created a fascinating map of regional identity written in superstition. A protective symbol that was common in the folklore of one village might be completely unknown in the next valley over. In regions with strong Celtic traditions, you might find windows framed with carvings of the Green Man, an ancient foliate head symbolizing rebirth and the raw power of nature, believed to bless the home with fertility and abundance. In alpine areas, traditions might dictate the painting of specific hex signs or rosettes on the wooden shutters of a farmhouse to protect the livestock within from bewitchment. The specific demon a carving was meant to ward off, the local saint invoked for protection, the particular pattern that signified good luck. All of these were hyper-local dialects in the broader language of belief. This means that two windows serving the identical practical function of lighting a bedroom could look completely different based on whether they were built in a Cornish fishing village fearful of storm spirits or a German forest settlement worried about wood sprites, each one a unique artifact of its community's deepest fears and most fervent hopes for protection. And just as the shape of a window could frame a sacred story or a defensive strategy, its very placement could be used to capture and measure time itself. Beyond marking social status or providing a view, certain windows were meticulously engineered to function as sophisticated astronomical instruments, transforming sunlight into a celestial clock that synchronized human activity with the grand, predictable rhythms of the cosmos. In an age before mechanical timekeeping was widespread, this architectural choreography of light was one of the most reliable ways to know the time of day, the season of the year, and the arrival of sacred moments in the liturgical calendar. A window was no longer just an opening in a wall. It became a permanent sundial, a solar observatory, and a profound link between the earthly and the divine order. This practice of solar alignment finds its most breathtaking expression in the great cathedrals, where the entire building was often conceived as a microcosm of the universe. The foundational axis of the structure was almost universally set on an east-west alignment, a tradition with roots deep in antiquity. This was no arbitrary decision. The eastern end, where the main altar was placed, was dedicated to the resurrected Christ, the Son of Righteousness, who promised new beginnings. By orienting the apse to the east, architects ensured that the rising sun on the morning of the spring equinox would pour directly through the great east-facing windows, flooding the altar and the choir in a dramatic burst of light. This annual event was far more than a pretty effect. It was a powerful physical manifestation of the resurrection, a symbolic victory of light over darkness that coincided with the Easter season. For the congregation witnessing this spectacle, it was a visceral, awe-inspiring confirmation of their faith, a moment where theology and nature aligned in a single, luminous miracle. The window was the precise instrument that made this miracle possible, its frame carefully calculated to capture that specific sliver of the horizon at that exact moment each year. But the precision did not stop with the equinox. Master masons and learned clerics collaborated to design windows that acted with even greater specificity, creating what are known as light shrines or sun daggers for particular feast days. A brilliant example can be found in the way many medieval churches handled the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. While the summer sun rides high in the sky, the winter sun takes a low, shallow path. A strategically placed window in a south-facing transept, perhaps a tall, narrow lancet, could be designed so that the weak, low-angled light of the winter solstice sun would reach deep into the shadowy interior, deeper than on any other day, and strike a specific point. This point might be a carved face on a capital, a specific tile on the floor, or a relic housed in a niche. The fleeting illumination of this target on the darkest day of the year was a promise of the light's return, a symbol of hope embedded in the very architecture. Similarly, a window might be calibrated so that a beam of light would illuminate a statue of a specific saint only on that saint's feast day, creating an annual event that felt both miraculous and deeply personal for the local community, binding their devotional life directly to the turning of the heavens. This intimate connection to agricultural cycles was just as critical for monastic communities, whose survival and routine were dictated by the seasons. In a monastery, time was a spiritual resource, and its division was a form of devotion. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, and so on structured the monastic day around prayer. The position of the sun, as it cast moving beams of light through specific cloister windows, served as a natural clock marking these hours. A monk assigned to wake the others for nocturnal prayers might know it was time for matins when a certain patch of moonlight, filtered through a west-facing window, touched a particular stone on the dormitory floor. The design of the cloister itself, with its covered walkway surrounding an open garden, was perfectly suited for this solar timekeeping. As the sun marched across the sky, the sharp line of shadow cast by the roofline would move along the opposite wall, its progress a silent, reliable indicator of the passing hours, telling the brothers when to gather for prayer, for meals, or for work in the fields. The window and the light it admitted were not just features of the monastery. They were essential participants in the rigid, sacred rhythm of monastic life. This profound integration of architecture and astronomy reveals a medieval worldview that saw no separation between the sacred and the scientific, the spiritual and the practical. The precise alignment of a window to capture a solstice sunbeam required sophisticated geometric knowledge and careful empirical observation that we would readily call science. Yet the purpose of that alignment was overwhelmingly spiritual, to create a moment of divine theater that reinforced faith. The window was the perfect meeting point of these two pursuits. It was a tool for understanding the mechanics of the universe and simultaneously a lens through which to experience the presence of God within that universe. This turns each uniquely calibrated window into more than just a timepiece. It is a fossilized thought, a permanent record of a mindset that saw the cosmos as an orderly, intelligible, and beautifully designed creation, and saw humanity's role as one of living in harmonious rhythm with its grand celestial design. But for all the celestial ambition and defensive genius, the story of every medieval window ultimately came down to two profoundly earthly factors: the weight of a purse and the depth of a quarry. While we marvel at the soaring tracery of a cathedral or the lethal efficiency of an arrow slit, we must also see them as financial documents, as meticulous records of cost, priority, and the stark economic realities that shaped the medieval world. The grandeur of a window was not just a measure of artistic vision. It was a precise indicator of available capital, a clear line drawn in stone and glass between wealth and want, making each opening a transparent ledger of its patron's means and ambitions. Consider the sheer, staggering expense of a single grand window. The journey began with the stone itself. Quarrying was back-breaking, dangerous work. Teams of laborers, using little more than picks, wedges, and hammers, would painstakingly extract massive blocks from the earth. Transporting these multi-ton stones from the quarry to the building site was a logistical nightmare, often requiring custom-built sledges, teams of oxen, and sometimes even barges if a water route was available. The cost escalated with every mile. Then came the masons, the elite craftsmen whose skills commanded high wages. A master mason, the architect and sculptor, was among the highest-paid workers on any site. His team of journeymen and apprentices would spend weeks, sometimes months, carving a single intricate window frame, their chisels slowly eating away at the expensive stone block. This was before a single pane of glass was even considered, and the glass, this was where the true financial reckoning began. Creating medieval glass was a form of alchemy that consumed fortunes. The base materials, silica from sand and potash from burnt wood, were costly enough, but the vibrant colors that defined Gothic splendor required rare and precious additives. That deep, heavenly blue that fills Chartres Cathedral, that came from cobalt oxide, a mineral that often had to be imported from distant mines in Central Europe at great expense. The ruby red that seems to glow with an internal fire, that was achieved by suspending tiny particles of actual gold within the glass melt. You were literally looking at money transformed into light. A single large stained glass window could cost more than a wealthy knight's annual income, a breathtaking investment that only the very richest institutions or individuals could even contemplate. This immense financial barrier is the fundamental reason why the windows of a peasant's hovel, a parish church, and a royal chapel look like they belong to different worlds. In a very real sense, they do. This economic reality led to a fascinating and very common practice within individual buildings, a clear hierarchy of windows based on importance and visibility. A patron, even a wealthy one, had to make shrewd decisions about where to allocate their finite resources. The result is that you can often read their priorities simply by walking through their castle or church. The most important spaces received the lion's share of the budget. The Great Hall, where the Lord entertained guests and dispensed justice, would feature the largest and most decorated windows as a direct display of power and status. The private chapel, a crucial venue for demonstrating piety, would often be next in line for the best glass and tracery, but then venture into the secondary spaces. The kitchen, the servants' quarters, the storage rooms, here the windows shrink dramatically. They might be simple, unadorned openings with at best panes of cheap, greenish-toned forest glass, or more likely, just wooden shutters to keep the weather out. This uneven distribution creates a tangible map of social value within the building itself. The light itself was rationed, with the brightest and most beautiful illumination reserved for the most important people and functions, leaving the working parts of the building in a perpetual, utilitarian gloom. This stratification wasn't just between different rooms, it could occur within the construction of a single grand window. A common cost-saving measure for even the wealthiest patrons was to concentrate the most expensive elements where they would have the greatest impact. The topmost sections of a tall window, farthest from the viewer's eye, might use less costly colors or simpler designs. The narrative scenes in the main panels would feature the prized blues and reds, while the decorative borders surrounding them might utilize more affordable greens, yellows, and ambers. Sometimes a patron on a tighter budget would commission a window but reuse glass from an older one, creating a charming but telling patchwork of different styles and periods within a single frame. These weren't mistakes or lack of vision. They were pragmatic compromises, the architectural equivalent of a finely tailored suit with a hidden mend, ensuring the overall impression of grandeur was maintained without triggering financial ruin. Ultimately, this economic lens forces us to see these windows not as ethereal objects divorced from worldly concerns, but as the direct products of a society defined by extreme inequality. The radiant wall of a cathedral, telling stories of divine grace and heavenly reward, was funded by the accumulated wealth of a powerful church in a world where most lived in poverty. The glittering windows of a royal palace were financed by taxes and levies extracted from the surrounding countryside. The exquisite but smaller window in a wealthy merchant's townhouse was a bold declaration of a new social class using cultural patronage to climb the rigid feudal ladder. Every decision, from the quarry to the glazier's workshop, was filtered through the sieve of economics. The result is a landscape where the architecture speaks a brutal truth alongside its beautiful poetry. The diversity of windows is a direct record of this economic diversity, a permanent testament to the fact that in the Middle Ages, the quality of the light you lived by was determined, first and foremost, by the weight of your purse. Yet for all their revolutionary spirit, the medieval builders were not starting with a blank slate. They were standing on the shoulders of giants, drawing from a deep well of architectural knowledge left behind by the Roman Empire and from the vibrant artistic traditions of the peoples who came after its fall. To truly understand the genius of the medieval window, we have to see it not as a spontaneous invention, but as the brilliant final chapter in a long conversation with the past, a masterful act of recycling and reinvention that turned ancient ideas into something breathtakingly new. The rounded arch, that quintessential symbol of Roman power and engineering prowess, is the perfect place to begin this story. The Romans had perfected the semicircular arch, using it to build everything from mighty aqueducts to colossal amphitheaters. It was a symbol of stability and strength, and when early medieval builders looked at the ruins of these structures dotting their landscape, they saw a form worth emulating. This is why the windows of the earliest Romanesque churches and castles so faithfully echo that Roman shape: small, sturdy, and crowned with a perfect, confident half-circle. They were borrowing an established language of power and permanence, but these new builders soon discovered a fundamental limitation of the rounded arch. While incredibly strong, it exerts a great deal of outward thrust, pushing against the walls that support it. This is why Romanesque buildings need those massively thick walls to contain the force of their own arches and vaults. It was a powerful, earth-hugging architecture, but it was also a confining one. The desire for taller, lighter, more luminous spaces forced a moment of brilliant crisis. Someone somewhere looked at the Roman arch and asked a revolutionary question: what if we change the shape? The answer was the pointed arch, the single most important innovation that made the Gothic revolution possible. By simply raising the apex of the arch to a point, the builders discovered they could channel the weight of the structure down more vertically into the supporting pillars. This dramatically reduced the outward thrust, which in turn meant the walls no longer had to be solid, load-bearing monsters. They could be pierced, dissolved, and replaced with glass. The pointed arch was the key that unlocked the wall, transforming it from a barrier into a frame. It was a profound act of creative disrespect, taking a revered Roman form and tweaking it just enough to unleash a completely new architectural potential. This dialogue with the past wasn't limited to grand structural ideas. It also played out in the realm of pure decoration, often in the most subtle and surprising ways. As the Gothic style flourished and stone tracery became more elaborate, the artisans carving these delicate stone webs sometimes reached back beyond Rome into the even older artistic heritage of their own lands. In the Celtic fringes of Britain and Ireland, for instance, the intricate, endlessly looping interlaced patterns that had adorned illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells and carved stone crosses began to subtly reappear. A stonemason might incorporate a panel of complex knotwork into the base of a window mullion or frame a delicate quatrefoil with a border of woven stone ribbons. This wasn't a literal copying of pagan art. It was the absorption of a local visual language into a new Christian context. The meaning shifted. The endless knot, once perhaps a symbol of eternity or protection in a pre-Christian belief system, could now be reinterpreted as a representation of the infinite nature of God or the interconnectedness of all creation. Similarly, in areas with strong Germanic influences, the fierce, stylized animal motifs, the dragons, wolves, and eagles that had adorned everything from shield bosses to jewelry, found a new life as grotesques and gargoyles. These mythical beasts, once symbols of power and guardianship in a warrior culture, were co-opted onto the rainspouts and roof lines of churches, their fearsome visages now serving to ward off evil spirits in the name of Christ. The old gods and guardians were tamed and put to work protecting the new faith. This incredible historical layering means that a single medieval window is rarely just one thing. It is a palimpsest, a parchment where older writings show through beneath the new text. You can stand before a magnificent Gothic window in a French cathedral and read its history like a book. The overall form, the pointed arch, speaks of the revolutionary Gothic spirit, the desire to reach for the heavens. The stone tracery itself, with its precise geometry, reflects the intellectual revival of the 12th century and a renewed interest in the mathematical harmony of the universe, an idea itself inherited from the Greeks via Arab scholars. And then, tucked away in a corner, you might find a carved capital depicting a green man, a foliate head from ancient fertility myths, now watching over a Christian chapel. Or the ironwork fastening the shutters might be forged into a pattern that echoes the metalworking traditions of a local tribe from centuries before. Each window becomes a unique artifact of this cultural conversation, a frozen moment where a mason made a choice to incorporate a fragment of the world he knew, a shape from a ruin, a pattern from an heirloom, a story from a song into the grand new project rising around him. They were not erasing the past, they were weaving it into the very fabric of their future, ensuring that every variation in stone and light told a story not just of faith and power, but of memory and identity. Stepping from the bustling, worldly concerns of castle life into the serene silence of a medieval monastery is like entering another universe, and the windows are the first to tell you so. Here, the purpose of architecture underwent a profound shift. No longer tools for defense or displays of earthly power, windows were reimagined as instruments of the soul, meticulously designed to facilitate a life dedicated to prayer, contemplation, and divine connection. Every aspect of their design, from their size and placement to the very quality of light they admitted, was calibrated to support a specific spiritual discipline, creating an environment where the built world actively participated in the pursuit of holiness. The monastery wasn't just a building where monks lived, it was a machine for salvation, and its windows were precisely tuned components in that sacred machinery. The heart of this contemplative machine was the cloister, a square garden courtyard surrounded by a covered walkway. This was the center of monastic life, a place for quiet reading, meditation, and solemn procession. The windows that opened from the walkway onto the garden were not grand, soaring affairs, but a series of humble, rhythmic openings, often separated by delicate pairs of columns. This design created a powerful visual effect. As a monk walked slowly along the arcade, the columns would pass before his eyes like a steady, visual metronome, while each window frame offered a carefully composed, almost painted view of the garden beyond. This was no ordinary garden. It was a hortus conclusus, an enclosed garden symbolizing the Virgin Mary's purity and the paradise that awaited the faithful. The window transformed nature into theology, framing a living symbol of Eden and focusing the monk's mind away from worldly distractions and toward eternal truths. The light entering these cloister windows was soft and diffused by the covered walkway, creating a tranquil, even light perfect for reading scripture or illuminating the pages of a manuscript without harsh glare, turning study itself into a form of prayer. This meticulous control of light and view extended throughout the entire monastic complex, reflecting the rigid hierarchy and ordered routine of communal life. The church itself, the spiritual core of the monastery, was a study in graduated luminosity. The public nave, where lay brothers or important guests might occasionally worship, might have simpler, more robust windows. But the monastic choir, where the monks themselves sang the divine offices 8 times a day, was often illuminated by the building's most magnificent windows. Here, the purpose was to elevate the spirit through beauty, to use dazzling stained glass and ethereal light to create a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem during the chanting of the Psalms. Conversely, the individual sleeping quarters of the monks, their cells, were the epitome of ascetic austerity. The windows here were often little more than deep, narrow slits, just large enough to admit a sliver of light and air, but far too small to provide a distracting view of the outside world. Their purpose was purely functional, to allow a monk to rise for nighttime prayers without stumbling, reinforcing a life of poverty, humility, and focus on the interior world of the spirit rather than the exterior world of the senses. This variation wasn't just about location. It was deeply influenced by the specific religious order that occupied the monastery. A Benedictine abbey, following the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized balance and the dignity of beauty in the service of God, might boast beautifully illuminated manuscripts and windows with rich, narrative-stained glass. Their architecture, including their windows, reflected a theology that saw the divine presence in all of creation. Walk into a Cistercian abbey from the same period, however, and you would experience a profound sensory shock. Following the reforms of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercians sought to eliminate any sensory distraction that could pull the mind away from pure, unmediated communion with God. Their famous austerity is etched into their windows. You would find no vibrant pictures, no rich colors, no human figures at all. Instead, the windows were glazed with grisaille, a monochromatic glass, typically in muted shades of gray, green, or white, painted with elegant, abstract patterns like delicate ivy or geometric lattices. This glass allowed copious amounts of pure, clear, undifferentiated light to flood their stark spaces, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming serenity and intellectual clarity. The light itself was the message, symbolizing the pure, unadorned truth of God, uncomplicated by human narrative. The difference between a Benedictine and a Cistercian window is the difference between a richly illustrated theological textbook and a page of pure, elegant mathematical equations. Both seek truth, but through entirely different aesthetic and spiritual pathways. Beyond the monk's cell, other specialized windows serve the unique practical needs of the monastic community. The scriptorium, where monks spent countless hours painstakingly copying texts, required a very specific kind of illumination. Its windows were carefully placed on the north side of the building. Why the north? Because northern light is consistent, steady, and free from the direct glare and moving shadows of the sun. This provided the perfect, unchanging working light for detailed artistic work, ensuring a scribe's hand wouldn't be disrupted by a sudden shift in shadow as he carefully formed a letter or painted a miniature. Similarly, the calefactory or warming room, the one place in the monastery where a fire was allowed, needed windows that could manage smoke while retaining precious heat, likely with adjustable shutters or ventilation holes high on the wall. Even the latrines, often built in a bridge-like structure over a running stream, had their own functional, unglazed openings designed for maximum ventilation and public health. Every single opening was a thoughtful response to a specific aspect of the regulated monastic life, proving that spiritual devotion and pragmatic ingenuity were two sides of the same coin, seamlessly integrated into the very fabric of the stone. The window, in this sacred context, becomes a silent monk itself, each one performing its specific duty within the ordered choir of the community, its form perfectly following its function in the shared pursuit of a life dedicated to God. But if we only judge these structures by our modern love for perfect symmetry and measured order, we risk missing a profound and intentional layer of their design philosophy. Walk around any great medieval cathedral or castle and try to find a perfectly symmetrical facade. You will likely search in vain. Instead of rigid mirror image perfection, you discover a dynamic and living composition. Windows are not lined up in neat military rows. They might be clustered in groups of 3 on one level, while a single, majestic lancet stands alone on another. A grand traceried window on the right might be answered by a smaller, simpler opening on the left. This was not a mistake or a sign of poor planning. This was a deliberate embrace of asymmetrical balance, a sophisticated artistic principle that created a far more engaging and spiritually resonant visual experience than cold, perfect symmetry ever could. This love for dynamic imbalance was born from a marriage of practical necessity and deep aesthetic wisdom. Unlike a modern architect working on a blank computer screen, the medieval master mason was always in a conversation with the real world. His canvas was often an irregular hilltop, a pre-existing older structure, or a building site cramped by a town wall or a river. He couldn't simply impose a perfect geometric plan onto this messy reality. Instead, he adapted. If the terrain sloped, the foundation might be deeper on one side, meaning the window openings on that side would naturally start at a different height. If he was adding a new chapel onto the side of an old church, he would work with the existing walls, creating a new rhythm of windows that harmonized with the old rather than slavishly copying it. These practical constraints forced a creative flexibility. The mason had to think in 3 dimensions, balancing the whole structure visually and structurally, not just one facade. The placement of a window on the outside was dictated by the needs of the space on the inside. A large window was needed to illuminate the altar, so it went there. A smaller one sufficed for a stairwell, so it was placed here. The external appearance was an honest reflection of the internal function, and this honest expression naturally led to a varied and asymmetrical composition. The true genius of these builders lay in their ability to turn these necessary adaptations into breathtaking aesthetic virtues. They understood a fundamental concept that artists through the ages have known. Dynamic asymmetry is far more interesting to the human eye than static symmetry. A perfectly symmetrical facade can be impressive, but it can also feel cold, predictable, and lifeless. An asymmetrical one, however, invites the viewer to explore. Your eye dances across the surface, drawn from the large mass of a rose window down to the delicate cluster of lancets beside it, then up to a lone, tall opening reaching for the sky. This visual journey creates a sense of movement and vitality. The building feels less like a frozen monument and more like a living, growing organism. The architects achieved balance not through mirroring, but through a careful weighting of visual elements. A single, massive window on one side could be balanced by a group of 2 or 3 smaller, more intricate windows on the other. The visual weight, the amount of attention an element demands, was what mattered, not its literal size or shape. It's the difference between holding a scale with identical weights on both sides and holding one with a single large weight perfectly counterbalanced by a cluster of smaller ones. Both are balanced, but one is infinitely more fascinating. This philosophy reflects a broader medieval worldview that valued organic growth and divine mystery over human-imposed order. The Gothic cathedral was meant to be a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, but it was not imagined as a sterile, perfectly planned city. It was seen as a living, breathing forest of stone, with trunks of pillars branching into vaults like a canopy of trees. In nature, we find balance and breathtaking beauty, but we almost never find perfect symmetry. A tree is not symmetrical. Its branches grow in response to sunlight and wind. A mountain is not symmetrical. The medieval mind saw God's hand in this complex, organic, and asymmetrical beauty. Therefore, to build a perfectly symmetrical building might have been seen as arrogant, an attempt to impose a simplistic human order on the glorious, complex wonder of God's creation. The intentional, beautiful imbalance of a facade was a humble acknowledgement of that complexity. It was a design principle that celebrated variety, adaptability, and context, creating structures that felt uniquely rooted in their specific place and purpose, each one an individual masterpiece that could never be truly replicated. Today, the painstaking work of conservation offers us a front-row seat to the very craftsmanship we've been exploring. When experts embark on restoring a medieval window, they aren't simply cleaning glass or repointing stone. They are conducting a meticulous archaeological investigation. Their goal is not to make the window look new, but to preserve its authentic story, layer by fragile layer. This process often reveals astonishing details invisible to the naked eye for centuries. Using advanced tools like microscopic analysis and raking light, conservators frequently discover that what appears to be plain stone was once vibrantly painted in ochres, azures, and vermilions, its figures and patterns meant to be read from the ground below. They find the subtle banker marks of the original masons, identify later repairs from the Victorian era that tried to improve upon the medieval design, and sometimes even uncover fragments of the original, priceless glass that had been hidden behind later panels. Each discovery is a direct message from the past, correcting our assumptions and deepening our understanding of the window's true character and the specific hands that shaped it. This respect for authenticity ensures that the unique voice of each window, with all its historical quirks and human imperfections, is not silenced by a well-intentioned but misguided desire for uniformity. This philosophy of thoughtful, context-driven design is finding a powerful resurgence in contemporary architecture. A growing number of modern architects are looking past the industrial era obsession with mass production and standardization turning instead to the medieval playbook for inspiration. They are embracing the core principle that a building, and particularly its windows, should be a direct and meaningful response to its specific environment, function, and cultural moment. You can see this in the work of architects who reject the one-size-fits-all glass curtain wall in favor of deeply considered openings that actively engage with their surroundings. A modern home in a cold, northern climate might feature windows with extraordinarily deep embrasures and triple glazing, not unlike their medieval predecessors, designed to trap solar gain and create cozy window seats that celebrate the shifting quality of light throughout the day, a direct nod to the solar strategies of the past. Conversely, a building in a hot, arid region might employ a sophisticated version of the mashrabiyah, using computer-designed ceramic or wooden screens to create intricate patterns that dapple the interior with shade and facilitate passive cooling, all while maintaining privacy. This isn't historical imitation. It's a translation of ancient wisdom into a modern language of sustainability and human-centric design. Perhaps the most profound lesson modern designers are taking from these ancient towers is the value of the human touch in an age of automation. In a world saturated with identical machine-made products, there is a growing hunger for authenticity and artistry. Just as no two medieval windows are alike due to the unconscious signature of the mason's hand, contemporary architects are collaborating with artists, blacksmiths, glassblowers, and stonemasons to introduce unique, handcrafted elements into their projects. A new civic library might feature a grand window whose leading forms an abstract pattern based on local topography, crafted by a master metalsmith. A private residence might commission a glass artist to create a bespoke panel that filters light into a specific, calming spectrum, turning a simple opening into a personal meditative space. This movement champions the idea that our built environment should not be cold and anonymous, but rather woven with stories, imperfections, and the evidence of human creativity. It argues that a building with a soul is one that reflects the individuality of its makers and its inhabitants, not the sterile precision of an assembly line. This ongoing dialogue between the medieval and the modern is far more than a stylistic trend. It is a crucial conversation about the values we choose to build into our future. The secret language of those ancient towers speaks to us across the centuries, reminding us that architecture is at its most powerful when it is specific, not generic. It tells us that a window is never just a window. It is a mediator between inside and out, a controller of light and air, a canvas for narrative, and a testament to the time and place of its creation. The enduring legacy of these structures is their glorious, unapologetic diversity. They stand as permanent proof that the highest form of creativity often lies not in conformity, but in the thoughtful, adaptable, and deeply human response to a unique set of challenges and inspirations. The secret language of medieval windows reveals a world where every opening was a masterpiece of intention, a profound synthesis of human need and creative spirit. These were not merely holes in a wall, but carefully considered decisions etched in stone and glass, each one a unique answer to a complex question. A window could be a weapon one moment, a prayer the next, and a declaration of status the moment after that, its forms shifting to meet the demands of defense, devotion, and social hierarchy. The breathtaking variety we see from the grim, cross-shaped aperture designed for a crossbowman to the celestial explosion of a rose window dedicated to the Virgin Mary stands as a permanent rebuke to the modern cult of uniformity. This was an architecture that proudly declared that context is king, and that the most beautiful and effective solutions are those born from a specific place, a specific time, and a specific human purpose. This celebration of diversity over standardization offers us a powerful lesson as we look at our own built environment today. We are surrounded by buildings clad in identical glass curtain walls, their windows mass-produced and indistinguishable, speaking a bland, international language of efficiency that often ignores local climate, culture, and history. The medieval mason would be baffled by this willful silence. His work teaches us that our surroundings can and should tell a story, that they should respond to the sun and the wind, to the threats and the hopes of the community. He shows us that beauty is not found in perfect, machined replication, but in the intelligent, artful, and sometimes imperfect adaptation to the world as it actually is. Those ancient towers encourage us to ask not what is cheapest or easiest to replicate, but what is most meaningful, most responsive, and most true to its purpose. So the next time you find yourself walking through an old city or gazing up at the silhouette of a distant castle against the sky, take a closer look. Don't just see a relic of a bygone age, see a living lesson. Look at the windows, notice how they are all different. Let your eye trace the unique curve of an arch, the particular pattern of the stone tracery, the way the light falls through a deep embrasure. In those details, you will find the fingerprints of the countless anonymous hands that built them: the masons, the glaziers, the blacksmiths. You will hear the whispered priorities of the patrons who funded them and the fears of the people who sought shelter within them. You will read a story written in light and shadow, a story of faith and fear, of power and poverty, of a deep, abiding connection to the land and the heavens. These structures are not silent ruins. They are conversations frozen in time, waiting for us to listen. Ultimately, the greatest legacy of these architectural marvels is an invitation to embrace a spirit of individuality and thoughtful intention in our own lives and creations. The medieval window stands as a testament to the idea that the things we build, whether they are physical structures, communities, or even our own personal journeys, are most enduring when they are infused with purpose and shaped by their unique context. It urges us to resist the pull of the generic and to instead celebrate the distinctive, the local, and the handmade. It reminds us that our world is richer for its variety, and that true innovation has always flourished not by following a template, but by listening closely to the specific needs of the moment and responding with creativity, courage, and a profound respect for the materials and the world at hand. The light that passed through those windows centuries ago still has something to illuminate if we are only willing to let it in.